Right.
So it's 2 o'clock on my screen, so I'm going to just say welcome and welcome to those that are already on the call. It's 2 o'clock. I will give it a moment for people to join, and then I hope someone will give me the nod, because I don't have actually in front of me the attendees, that there's a sufficient number to make it worth starting. I think I'm going to perhaps go for it. Okay, so hello, welcome, good afternoon on this horrible rainy spring afternoon. This is a rerun, a second attempt, if you will, of the Cyber Essentials deep dive into the updates of the technical controls. Those were first shared in January of this year, and a session was held with a large audience to give a high-level overview of the changes introduced that were to be introduced this year, at the time later in the year on the 24th of April, which is today. What an amazingly coincidental day. Now then, following that, on the 14th of March, we attempted to do a deep dive where we could go into some specific points and respond to some questions and feedback and areas of particular interest to people following the January session. That ended up being subject to multiple IT challenges and problems. There was a lot of hilarity and humour in the chat, which I had many a happy moment reading later. But this is now the rerun of that session. So my name is Ellie. I work for the NCSC. I've worked in the government department 20 years, a number of years in industry assurance services, and I lead on a number of schemes, one of which is Cyber Essentials. I don't need to introduce Cyber Essentials as a scheme. I'm sure almost everyone on this call is very familiar with Cyber Essentials and is interested in the changes to the technical controls that have been introduced this year. And that's what we're going to do. I think I've kind of covered who I am and why we're here, and that's probably all I'm going to do. I'm assuming from the calmness that has all gone really well, and I've stayed connected and I've managed to be heard and perhaps seen by everyone. I'm not even sure if my camera's on for people to see it. I can see myself, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can. But I can see Neil. So NCSC works very closely with its delivery partner, IASME, who run the scheme for us, work with us on many elements of the scheme, the day-to-day delivery, as well as all the areas of improvement, evolvement and development of the scheme and certifications. So Neil, who is the scheme owner, manager for IASME, is going to take over from me and go through the slides on this deep dive session. Okay, thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you, Ellie. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this rerun of the deep dive. Okay, so as everybody should be aware, Cyber Essentials is owned by the NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre, and IASME are the delivery partner for this scheme. And we work very much in partnership with the NCSC to deliver the scheme on an administrative side, but also on the technical side. And to give you my background, I sit as part of the technical working group and been heavily involved in the scheme developments over the last 3 years. So we asked for feedback of the initial session in January, and it's come back that we've come back with some core areas that need to be readdressed, and all the slides you will see presented this afternoon are based on questions that were received from that feedback session, and also the common areas we have issues around, and you know, many pieces of feedback from many different organizations and many different areas. So this is a dive into those things. So if you're familiar with these, it's a bit of a refresher session, but hopefully it will clarify some points around some of the key areas that we get most of our questions about. So just want to give a basic outline of Cyber Essentials and what it's really about, and some of the key areas that are often missed as well. So the requirements that are set out are for mitigating against the most common internet-based threats to your cybersecurity. So these are the commodity internet attacks. These are the easy, low-skilled attacks that take place, which many cyber incidents, cyber attacks now begin with in the first instance. And the requirements and controls that are in Cyber Essentials are derived from the 10 steps to cybersecurity, and they're seen as 5 essential mitigations against to provide protective measures against a cyber attack. And the technical controls outline are based on a risk assessment which is carried out by the NCSC and on behalf of the UK government, which is why, following up on the fourth point here, the controls are prescriptive and relevant to organisations of all sizes. So the mitigations, the preventative mitigations that are outlined, which make up the 5 controls, don't have an element of risk and are prescriptive in why they are being asked for. So when we ask, that's why it's sometimes seen as very final when we talk about the decisions here and what we're allowing within the scheme, but they are prescriptive measures. So I want to talk about some of the principles actually of the scheme, because we need to readdress these, and these are based on the feedback, as I said, that came out of the session in January. And it seems to be sometimes the measures or the principles, sometimes we talk about stuff in too much technical depth, when actually Cyber Essentials is trying to promote some core principles that help prevent these kinds of attacks. So all the controls that are outlined in Cyber Essentials should be applied by technical configuration. So this means that you need to configure your password policies within the technical solutions or cloud services you have available. So currently, if you don't have multi-factor authentication or an approved deny list of passwords in place, you would need to set your passwords on devices and software services and cloud services with a 12-character password where you can configure it. All devices which have access to the internet are in scope. So when you have your networks that are in scope and devices connecting to the internet, please treat them as in all those devices are in scope. It's quite a simple principle because we are interested in the cyber attacks that come from the internet. All devices in scope must be using a supported operating system. Very clearly, this follows on to the next point, because they must be receiving regular security updates provided by the vendor. And this also applies to all software installed on these devices. It is often difficult to understand and find the information here about supported operating systems, but in general, we're looking at in the Windows world, it's Windows 10 or 11, and looking for the last 3 feature releases will be the versions that are currently supported and receiving those security updates. It's slightly more complicated when talking about Android devices, but we look on And we certainly, when we're looking at compliance for this area, we're looking at the version of Android, and those are listed within the Android security bulletin provided by Google. In the iOS world, currently it still is iOS 15 and iOS 16. So we say when it's supported, it means it's receiving regular security updates provided by the vendor. But for firewalls and routers, they must also be supported and receiving regular firmware updates from the vendor. The reason we ask for firmware on these devices is because that is considered the firewall or router's operating system. I will come on to this a little later, but there is a change about the level of detail to assist the assessors in determining when a firewall or router is supported compared to that when it's operating system on the other devices. Just to follow on, there's some more principles here that need to be discussed, and one of them is BYOD devices. This was seen as a big change when we brought out, or we took over sole delivery of the scheme back in 2020. But BYOD has always been part of the scheme, and they are always in scope when they're used to carry out activities for the organisation, or you as the applicant are using those devices and allowing your users to use their personally owned devices. And this includes accessing email, document creation, accessing virtual desktop solutions. So these are ones where they connect through to a Citrix-based solution, a remote desktop session, something like that, where the actual desktop they are working on is hosted on a server environment. Another area of confusion is we get a lot of discussion about data and data classification. Organizational data, as per the definition in the Cyber Essentials requirement document, is all data that is owned by the organization. We don't deal with data classification because data classification is about information assurance certification linked with other kinds of certification. We just class data as is all data within your organization for CE. All cloud services that are used by the organization are in scope. So we'll come on to this and I'll present the definition of a cloud service very shortly. But this is most important because in most cases, the majority of cases now, your data is hosted or located in cloud services, and you want to put protections around those services because they are accessible via the internet. And I say, just to reiterate, all software on devices must be supported and receiving security updates on a regular basis. And when it comes to usage of accounts and the account separation requirement, Cyber Essentials promotes the principle of least privilege or just enough on each account that is in use. So this is not a time elevation thing where you elevate a user account for a set period of time to install software. We still require the use of separate accounts, and the user accounts would have the least privilege with no administration rights on that. But they should be a separate administration account used that is not used to carry out daily activities on those devices. So we did get a lot of questions come in via the feedback from the initial session, and there was a few things about cloud services. And one of them was, what is a cloud services for the purposes of CE? A cloud service is where an applicant subscribes to a service, either paid or free, and controls who has access and or carries out administrative duties. So if you can carry out administrative duties on a cloud service, set the password length, set and create users for that service. That is a service that is in scope for Cyber Essentials. So these are kind of services like Office 365, Google Workspace, Salesforce, some account packages, etc. But if you have a booking portal, something like that, where you don't have control of user setup, you don't have any control over the password security that is forced upon you by the vendor, and they have set it without you being able to make any changes, that would be classed as a web service, not a cloud service. A cloud service you are subscribing to, and that is free or paid. So we need to make that clear. It's where you have good full administrative duties over it, and you can set up users. It's really quite simple there, because you can enforce the controls of Cyber Essentials on that cloud service. And all cloud services using this definition need to be declared. There is no way of segregating different cloud services. They all offer a potential risk to your organization if not configured with the controls of using MFA to access those cloud services. So MFA is required on all your cloud services for both users and administrators. And MFA is required if it is included as part of the cloud service or offered as a paid option. The reason for this is quite clear, is that MFA adds a completely additional level of security to these cloud services and offers you an enhanced level of protection, and is highly recommended by the NCSC and is throughout many of their guidance articles and many of their awareness programs out there. If a cloud service does not offer any form of MFA, it will not result in an automatic failure of the assessment. Additional information will need to be provided, and that information will help gather feedback on which services are not applying it, and it will be used to start to be applying pressure and contacting those organizations where we see the same cloud service come through on multiple assessments. We will start to use that to talk to them and start to make them aware of the benefits of having MFA in place. The reason for this slight change in the scheme is that we recognise that this is often an issue which applicants have no control over. We've had many cases over the last year or so where we've been looking at this since we introduced in January 2022, and it's come to we've been made aware that some of these issues with MFA not being available are out of control of the applicant organisation. And it's not just a case of it's just not a case of those organisations not switching MFA on for their administrators and users. But as I say, we do ask for, if you answer no, that you can't apply MFA in the A7.14 of the question set, we do then ask you to list the cloud services that don't offer any form of multi-factor authentication. Another area that we get a lot of information about and a lot of queries about is legacy systems or unsupported systems. So we're talking about software solutions, etc. Legacy unsupported systems should be segregated from the in-scope network by firewall or VLAN segregation. This is a level of segregation deemed to create new network segments, which put a barrier in between the in-scope network and the outer scope systems, that those are legacy. Legacy systems, because they are no longer receiving security updates or support, should not be exposed to the internet, which is a very good security measure to avoid those systems being exposed and available to be attacked. So in order to remove such legacy systems, you use network segregation by firewall or VLAN. So this does require a bit of technical configuration. So if a network segment, which you've taken out of scope with a legacy system on it, has no internet connection, you can achieve whole company certification. But if a network segment has internet access to that legacy system, whole company certification is not possible, and an excluding statement is required within the scoping questions of the assessment, and that particular question is A2.2. I come back to BYOD. BYOD, as I said, mentioned, is part of the scheme and is when it's connecting to any organizational data or service. There are no difference in controls required to any other device. So they must be, and its most important thing is they must have a supported operating system. It's so they can effectively apply the controls as outlined in the requirements document. And BYOD has been part of the scheme since June 2014. If you reference the old requirements document, it is clearly stated in that document. BYOD usage should be tracked using a technical control and monitored for operating system compliance. Many of the main cloud services offer tracking for the devices connected and will give you a level of information about supported operating systems. And one area I want to touch on very quickly regarding BYOD. Yes, when you're using a virtual desktop solution, those BYOD devices connecting to that virtual desktop solution are in scope for assessment. There have been registered commodity internet attacks against BYOD devices connecting to such virtual desktop solutions where they are leaving the session open. This information was provided to us by the subject matter experts at the NCSE, and we have discussed its implications and whether these particular this particular usage of BYOD devices should remain as part of Cyber Essentials. And as we've had no information so far to state they should be taken out of the scheme. So BYOD devices clearly remain in scope when connecting to a VDI solution. They were the main key areas that all came up in the question set when we collated all the questions from the session in January, and they are feedback areas that we have received since we launched the changes back in January and gave the 3-month consultation period. So that was the feedback we got there. But I just want to touch on another area regarding the assessment process, which has also been a change that came in and announced in January as well. And it's regarding the level of detail in the scoping questions regarding devices. So end user devices and servers, this should say, we are asking for make an operating system. And as this next bullet point says, clearly no longer require the model. Okay. We are interested and focusing on the devices being able to run a supported operating system, which is why I stressed earlier about the importance of using a supported operating system receiving security updates. Firewalls and routers, however, we will be asking, still remain to ask for make and model. That's enough information for an assessor to determine whether their device is still supported with firmware. As I stated earlier, firmware of a firewall and router is the operating system of that device. So just to clarify again, unsupported operating systems that are declared within the assessment will result in an automatic failure of the assessment. All questions within the question set on Montpellier will now need to be, well, all questions need to be answered. And you need to be compliant on nearly all questions in order to pass. Okay, so this comes back when we talk about MFA, we talked about you will be marked down or you need to provide different answers. This is why you don't need to be slightly compliant, because we've turned it into a yes, no, and marked 2 of the MFA questions for as information only. So this is why we state that it's nearly all questions in order to pass. Okay, so that's the end of that. But I want to give you some updates about future changes regarding the scheme, etc., just to give you an awareness at this stage. So the Montpellier question set has gone live today. Any applications for Cyber Essentials as of today will be on the Montpellier question set and against the version 3.1 of the requirements. So if you apply for Cyber Essentials from today, the grace periods that were on the Evandine question set have now ceased. So you will need to do MFA for all administrators and all users of your cloud services. All your thin client devices must be supported and receiving regular security updates, and legacy or unsupported software now must be in a segregated network and removed from scope of assessment. But we also would like to let you know that we are planning what the future roadmap for the next 2 years regarding Cyber Essentials. So we are now going to carry out a question set review. This will include a 12-month feedback period in 2024. This review is to look at the accessibility of the question set, whether what improvements we can make, etc., add more guidance. But what we want to do also is, rather than just release that to you live on a future date, we do want to give a long period of feedback on that process, because Cyber Essentials is an education process as much as gaining a certification, and we would like to make improvements about that with the awareness and accessibility to Cyber Essentials, and try to give more guidance, etc., to help the application process be a worthwhile experience. But the next planned question set change is April 2025, but there is an asterisk against this because changes could still happen, but that would be at the request of the NCSC and any evidence and information obtained via their subject matter experts, incident response teams, etc. But then there's no planned changes regarding the question set for 2 years, and there's no planned technical changes next year. But that's not to say, unless something in the wild out there, a new threat, etc., becomes very prominent, we may then have to make a change. But tucked in amongst there as well is something else that we at IASME will be working a lot on over the next few months, is we're going to make a Cyber Essentials public knowledge base. There's a lot of issues around feedback regarding consistency of the scheme. So we are going to make a public knowledge base. So not only yourselves, the applicants can see information definitely targeted around Cyber Essentials and the assessment and the different decisions around what is and what is out of scope, and how the requirements are applied, but that can also be referenced by our Cyber Essentials assessors and the Cyber Essentials advisors, so they then can provide consistent advice about the scheme. We'll publish information about any changes, etc., and the knowledge base about Cyber Essentials, and I would suggest you monitor the Cyber Essentials LinkedIn pages, Twitter, and any other social media we do. So to get the up-to-date information, it'll be posted via our social media channels and future blogs from IASME and the NCSC. That is the end of this presentation, but we're now ready to take questions and answers. I'm sure there's been some come in. So if you have any questions, please post those in the question and answer section, and we will happily answer those. Do we have any questions that need immediate answer from the team dealing with the question and answers that we could possibly answer here?
Hi, Neil, maybe you could go over the when, make and model is needed and the difference between mobile devices, what's required there, and firewalls, because I think there's some confusion there.
Right, okay. So let's start about this quickly. So we've got, if laptops and desktops, you need to supply the information which will be make and operating system. Servers, make and operating system. Mobile phones, so that's all smartphones and tablets, that will be make and operating system as well. That's the level of detail we require. We've put some information into the question set when you apply, and we are working on a knowledge base article to explain this and give examples. The firewall situation is, we are asking for make and model. That information is available. We don't ask for the specific level of detail regarding firewalls at this stage. It's a level of detail that could provide too much information when collected, and it often is quite difficult to obtain that information. Many of these new devices now do auto updates for the firmware. It's when those firewalls and routers no longer receive that, you can consider those going out of date and unsupported. It is something to be aware of. They do go out of date if you're getting from the major manufacturers such as Cisco, Fortinet, etc. They probably have a 3 to 4 year life cycle and would require a subscription to obtain those security updates. But the level of detail for firewalls and routers is make and model. The assessors have information and are able to assess whether those devices are still supported with that level of detail.
Thanks, Neil. There's another question here about with zero trust, how does this affect the ability to complete the internal workstation assessment? Do you want to talk about how Cyber Essentials aligns to zero trust?
Yeah, zero trust is a new area of advice that we have put into this year's requirements. So in the version 3.1 requirements, there's some guidance that's been written. We know that zero trust is a common area of discussion, and sometimes we have assessments saying we don't need to apply the controls of Cyber Essentials because we've got zero trust in place. Part of the work that's been carried out over the last year has been to compare the NCSC model, zero trust model, and the requirements of Cyber Essentials. From that work and mapping that was carried out, there is a direct correlation between zero trust and Cyber Essentials. There are 6 areas of control within Zero Trust model published by the NCSC, one of which is monitoring and logging. Monitoring and logging is not part of Cyber Essentials, but the other 5 areas are all part of the 5 controls of Cyber Essentials. So if you are adopting a Zero Trust model within your organization, you should be using and applying the 5 controls of Cyber Essentials to achieve that Zero Trust, and thus you should be able to make yourself compliant for Cyber Essentials.
I'll read out another one.
Yeah.
When segmenting off a section of the network to bring it out of scope, what is the requirement for no access to the internet? Does the device need to be completely isolated or just not accessible from the internet? What about restricted access to specific addresses controlled by firewall rules or via proxy?
If they have access at any stage across the internet as such through firewall rules or proxy, that will be connected to the internet in some form. When we say that the legacy system needs to be segregated with no internet, there's no inbound or outbound connections to that legacy system of any kind. It's quite a simple rule there. If we were to go into the level of allowing certain network configurations and specific firewall rules by IP address, that was something we actually took out the scheme last year, and we're not intending to implement that. We would really like to see legacy systems completely, well, not exposed to the internet at all.
Thank you. Another question. If an organization does not control admin activities on their 365 tenant because it's outsourced, does it fall out of scope as a cloud service?
Now, it depends how the 365 service is outsourced. If you've outsourced it to your MSP or IT support company to do the administration for you, you are still subscribing to that service. You're paying the subscription, and you will need to apply the controls of Cyber Essentials. If somebody else is the owner of the tenant and they're doing all the administration and you're not paying for somebody to do the administration on your behalf, that is when it's up to that applicant, that organization who are administering that service will need to obtain CE. But where you're outsourcing it to an MSP or an IT services company to do the administration for yourselves, that remains in scope.
Great. So another question.
Yep.
Does the definition for cloud services in scope mean that an organization must be aware of every employee's use of any cloud service, and must that usage be centrally managed?
This comes down to an area that we've also added further guidance to within Cyber Essentials this year in the version 3.1 requirements. We've added a section about advice around asset management. So you should have an awareness of all your devices, all the software services, and all the cloud services in use by your organizations. Those cloud services you're not monitoring, they could still pose a threat, and you should be making some awareness of those present, because you still need to apply controls to those services and make sure where they are available, they must be using MFA on those services. So there is that level of asset management, and we do talk about asset management not only being devices now. So that is a new area of advice, and it's absolutely the foundation of a Cyber Essential assessment to know all the services, all the devices, and all the software in use by your organization.
Thank you. A little bit on with that. For mobile devices, how would you recommend dealing with devices that are not used regularly? So, for example, we have some staff who might leave a phone unused for more than 14 days and therefore miss the target for updates as they're not online and checked in.
I think the simple answer here is, and the pragmatic answer is, before they're actually used again, the first job that when they're switched on is to get them checked for updates. We have this situation with people who go on holiday. Again, they may go for a 2 or 3 week holiday if they're lucky enough with the 3 weeks. But when they come back, the first job that should happen is make sure and apply updates as soon as possible from that device being turned on.
Thank you. Another question. It is often difficult and impractical to get certified in large organisations with complex IT infrastructure, such as HE with all the changes. Are we able to subdivide, silo off projects in order to limit the scope at which CE is applicable?
Yes, you can do what we call subsetting. It's also defined within the version 3.1 requirements, the ability to divide off your organizations when internally via network segments and apply projects to those network segments, and the users of those network segments, if they're using the cloud services, that will bring those into scope. But yes, it is possible to do that. It's often a complex area. It's probably the area we discuss the most within support tickets. And if you have a particular scenario, I suggest you drop a call to IASME with the contact details info@iasme.co.uk, and we can discuss that further. But the general rule of thumb here is to use a network segment within your in that scenario.
Right. If an organisation has a policy that we do not allow BYOD, is a technical control needed to stop unauthorised BYOD?
That's a good question. That would be something that the organisation needs to find a solution to. But if the general rule of thumb that they're not allowing BYOD, you'd be monitoring, or you'd have your cloud services would not allow them to connect. So you'd only be allowing authorized devices supplied by the organisation. So you would be having to monitor that. And again, it comes down to asset management, your understanding of how and which devices are connecting to your cloud services.
Right.
Yeah.
Are BYOD devices connecting to VDI systems in scope in the Evendine rule set, or just in the Montpellier?
No, this discussion has been had for a number of years now, and those BYOD devices also apply under the Evendine question set. So if you applied for Cyber Essentials yesterday or before that, you could still use the Evendine question set, and yes, those BYOD devices apply.
Just finding another question.
Yeah.
If a Linux firewall OS is used, not a hardware firewall, what make, model, OS info is needed?
Well, we're going for that particular, as it's a software solution, we're going to be looking at the make and operating system of that particular firewall solution. This is when we're talking about virtual appliances and other systems, but we need that operating system of that Linux version to be supported. Again, it's not an area that comes up a lot, but we do have it. And it's probably best to log a support call if you're unable to find out that information, and we can discuss further.
I'm getting a little bit confused by some of the questions now that are referring to other questions. How can we enforce cloud services to set up MFA, two-factor authentication, SSO, where they are not a direct supplier to us? For example, where a client sends a link to Dropbox or WeTransfer in order for us to accept or share documents with them, but we do not have a contract for Dropbox or WeTransfer.
Again, this is going to come down to if this is the client who's asking you to use Dropbox or WeTransfer, it would be up to them to set the MFA up. But those services, we certainly know that Dropbox has some MFA on it, and if it was your instance, if it's a free instance or whatever, you would have expected yourselves to be logging into MFA and where possible for those clients, but they may well be using their own account and to access the Dropbox, and that would only be they would be the people who can configure that level of MFA.
So
Again,
here's one about, sorry, Neil.
Go on. No. Again, it's one of those ones where there are what we call edge cases where perhaps you need a little bit more advice. It's useful to provide this feedback to us at IASME, and we certainly can help. It helps shape the scheme, and if we need to cater for these kinds of setups and scenarios, it's something we perhaps need to give more guidance on, and we could write an article for the knowledge base to do that. So we're willing to discuss these kind of edge cases, and we can discuss them further, and we can then create better articles for yourselves so you can understand how it's applied better.
So here's one about how the decisions are made. Can you explain a little about the makeup of the technical working group for Cyber Essentials? How do you ensure that all affected stakeholders are represented? And are organisations of all sizes represented?
I can answer part of that. Emma, you can help me out with that one.
Yes.
Yes. Right, the Cyber Essentials Technical Working Group, it was created when we became the delivery partner for Cyber Essentials, meets on a weekly basis, and that is made up of members of IASME technical team and the NCSE technical team. And also we have input from the NCSE subject matter experts and incident response teams and other key stakeholders within the NCSE. But that is only the beginnings of it all. All the feedback, we get loads of feedback on the scheme. And I have colleagues who probably didn't know how much feedback we were getting about the scheme 3 years ago, now realise we get an awful lot of feedback. And people on this call, we have all been involved with various feedback meetings with various organisations, from the largest organisations to the smallest organisations, and we do try to take everything on board. It's almost a full-time job to deal with the Cyber Essentials feedback.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Go on,
so
Emma.
we also we use our certification bodies. We use quite a lot of them for a sounding board, and we've started to do that more. And of course, our certification bodies are organisations of all sizes, but it's something that we are planning for next year, which is why the next question set is going to take much longer to come out, because we are planning in a much wider consultation phase. We recognise that as the scheme grows, we have to consult wider. So hopefully you will see much more of that going on as we go forward. Right, another question. Let me just find one. There's a lot of BYOD questions, as we would expect. Can a policy be used for BYOD endpoint compliance rather than technical controls?
This has been a difficult area, and we understand that, but there does need to be a technical element applied when managing BYOD devices. It can be a mixture of technical and written policy. This is actually in a blog statement by the NCSE, but we can't allow written policy only in this area. It is important that you understand that these devices are supported and able to receive regular security updates. BYOD devices, based on evidence that is provided to us and the findings of subject matter experts, the NCSE, are very important, and also it forms is required in a lot of the guidance by the NCSE that they should be monitored and checked, and make sure that they are in support. It's a vital part. We are aware it's an issue, but I do state, look at your cloud services, look what's available within your cloud services that are able to monitor for operating system compliance to help out there, but they do need to be, there does need to be an element of technical control over them.
And going on from that, Neil, in Microsoft 365 Intune, MAMWE, is that enough for BYOD device management? We can assure devices are up to date, not jailbroken and have a PIN, but we do not have control over the apps installed on the device. However, as MAMWE sandboxes the business data and has controls to stop personal and business being copy pasted mixed, is that enough to comply with the control?
It is an element of the control, but you would need to definitely back that up with having approved apps to access your organizational data. It is a little bit that goes beyond it. You can't just rely on them being in a container. You do need to know which apps are in that container and accessing your organizational data. It is actually something we do at IASME. And we are aware of which apps are connecting to our organizational data. Often, if you're using Intune, you're trying to connect to 365 apps anyway, and by definition, MMA is a version of application management, so there should be some form in there.
Great. This one says, our organisation is currently working towards gaining a Cyber Essentials certificate. We were going by the previous question set up until now. Rather than scanning through the 2 documents for changes, do you have a list of what's specifically been changed that we should be aware of?
I think we have a document that we're working on to make that available. I don't think we've published one at this stage, but we can do.
Fantastic. Just searching. There's a lot of complicated ones about BYOD. With the change to no longer requiring endpoint device model, does that allow organisations such as schools, charities to sweat older assets, such as laptops, that may no longer be supported by the vendor, provided that the operating system is up to date and supported?
Yes, as long as that device can run one of the latest feature releases for Windows 10 or Windows 11, that is allowable. That is what we are looking at. The firmware of the devices is particularly difficult to keep up to date and monitored, but there isn't. There's some research being done within the NCSC to see whether that firmware is under attack from commodity internet attacks. Those are the easy attacks, the low skilled attacks. That is still being researched, but at this time it was decided that we would concentrate on make and operating system. So if a device can support one of the latest 3 versions of Windows 10 as a rule of thumb, or one of the latest versions of Windows 11 as a rule of thumb, that is acceptable. And we are aware that from certain manufacturers, some devices, maybe 10 years old, can support that. So yes, that is acceptable.
Great. So at the start of the session, it was said that the reason Cyber Essentials technical controls are prescriptive is because of an NCSC risk assessment. I'm not sure I understand the logic. Could this be explained a bit more? Sounds like saying that because there is a risk, there must be a technical control. I mean, I can say a little bit about that if you want. So a lot of certification schemes, as you know, are risk-based. So this involves an organisation doing a risk assessment, deciding what the risks are, and then they have a risk appetite. So with some of those risks, they will say, I'm going to accept that risk. I know what the risk is and I'm going to accept it. But obviously for organisations, that's very subjective. So some organisations might be a bit more risk takers than others. Some, it might depend on what they can afford. So when it's government data, for example, or a customer's data, they will want to have a say in what risks are acceptable and what aren't. So NCSC did a risk assessment, and out of that risk assessment, looking at the risks, they say, OK, coming out of that, these are the mandatory controls that we want you to put in place. And that's where Cyber Essentials came from. Do you want to add anything to that, Neil?
No, not really. I think you've answered that one well enough.
Okay. Great. Yeah, so someone's just saying that a red line copy of the question set, like ISO 27001, would be helpful in future to identify changes between versions. Yes, we do know that. We will get one of those published.
Yeah.
I think we did a couple of years ago. We will do that for this year. In higher education, are students' BYOD phones and other devices in scope?
One of the things we have done this year is we have provided a table in the version 3.1 requirements, which are presented on in January. There's a table in there that states when a device is in scope or not. And BYOD devices owned by a student are not in scope of Cyber Essentials. Now, if they're connected to the business network of an organization, they will present a risk, so we would expect them to be done. But if they're on a separate guest Wi-Fi or student network, they are not in scope.
Great. Are firmware updates no longer a requirement for end user devices anymore, then, if devices are not needed to be in support?
Yes, we've changed the definition in the requirements. The requirements document pre-version 3.1, it just said all firmware was classed as software. We've now changed that to router and firewall firmware as being in scope. That's part of the definition. So device firmware on your laptops, desktops is no longer need to be updated and provided with those updates at the present time. That's quite clear. You know, often with Windows 10 and Windows 11, you are getting firmware updates anyway. They are most of the time now published through operating system updates. That's certainly correct in the tablet and mobile phone worlds. So that's why we state they must have a supported operating system. If they don't have it, they're not going to get those updates anyway. But it's particularly difficult in the desktop laptop world. But we aren't saying anything about, we're not asking for firmware compliance.
Great. Could I ask Andy now to read out and then answer a question about Cisco equipment?
Sure, thanks, Emma. So I saw this one come in and I've been trying to think of the words to type and I couldn't really think of it, but I know the answer. So what about methods such as SDA from Cisco for network segregation? Is this allowed? A lot of organizations are adopting this type of technology and replacing network equipment to implement this technology. So this actually did come up on the tech working group over the last year. It has been looked into. Now, obviously, we've got to be very careful because we are completely vendor neutral within the scheme, so we can't call out, the proprietary systems used by Cisco. But what the decision was made back on that technical working group was that the assessor could, if the assessor could determine that there was still some kind of layer 2 segregation happening beneath, which is quite common, and SDA does offer it. And when we looked into SDAs, we did find that underneath it, you could implement the layer 2 segregation. As long as that was happening, that was compliant for the scheme. So it was that decision to be made by an assessor in conjunction with the applicant. Now, we do know that this is something that is on the horizon for a lot of people, and we will continue to look through it as we keep going on and progressing through with the scheme.
Great, thanks, Andy. Just looking for some more. Some of them are quite long.
Yeah.
Have you got any more you would like to answer, Andy? Oh, here's one. Here's one about renewals. So if you achieve Cyber Essentials on the 1st of the month and pass Cyber Essentials Plus at the end of the same month, what do the renewal dates look like? Do you have to renew Cyber Essentials by the 1st of the month, or has the Cyber Essentials Plus date superseded Cyber Essentials date?
Oh, good question. You would have when the from the date that the Cyber Essentials self-assessment questionnaire, there's a 12-month expiry period on that. So you would have to renew on the anniversary of the self-assessment and then complete the CE Plus again within the allotted time frame, which is 3 months.
Great. I think
Got
we
another
are.
one.
Okay, yes, please, Andy.
Yeah, so one that's come in: if a third-party contractor uses their own equipment to access our services, is that in scope in the same way that employee BYD devices would be? So that's the same. I think Neil's already answered this question in relation to student devices. So again, in that table, we've done a whole section in the requirements now to guide you through different scenarios and different third-party devices and the accounts. So what we say is that the accounts, they belong to the organisation, so they're always going to be in scope of the assessment, and the controls must be applied. The devices, maybe not so much. It depends. Look at that table and it will guide you through, and it's basically it's just beyond the scope of the assessment. For in this case, a third-party contractor is beyond the scope of an assessment, and it's up to that organisation or the applicant to determine how they're going to ensure that the third-party contractors' devices are have the controls applied to them. So that could be through their contract. You know, they could bring it into scope if they wanted to, but it's just beyond the scope of the requirements to make that decision for you in this case.
Thank you, Andy. I've got one here for Ellie. If the NCSC risk assessment and moderation of risk appetite confirms the government's interest or risk appetite, does that mean Cyber Essentials might eventually become a replacement for government or MOD accreditation?
Thanks, Emma. So the question is in the question because in exams and tests and things, I tend not to read them properly. So I've just read that for the second or third time. And I think what it's saying is, if I can go back to it, if in the moderation of, I've lost it. These things jump up really quickly.
It's been published. Sorry, I published it, Ellie.
That's fine.
So
that's
it's in
good.
The published
right.
clue.
I'm with it. So if the NCSC risk assessment and moderation of risk appetite, I'm wondering, does that mean the activity of the NCSC in doing that, or if it is referring to the moderation of risk appetite as something that Cyber Essentials might do? Because I think Cyber Essentials is simply all about the huge variety of risk appetite that's out there, and how subjective and rightly variable it is across government, across industry, certainly, and across MOD as well. So the short answer is no, there are no intentional plans for Cyber Essentials to become any replacement for government or MOD accreditation. I do have to just say, I always get twitchy using the word accreditation because UCAS get extremely bothered about NCSC referring to their activities as any form of accreditation. We like assurance. They're all words, it's all terminology, and we don't want to be hung up by that. So we provide a lot of assurance activities in various ways, and some of them are risk management approaches, and some of them, as Emma rightly explained, that Cyber Essentials was never intended to be that. I was itching to say when Emma answered that, I was thinking, well, it's kind of because of the certification, the certificate. We might provide assurance to MOD and give a risk statement at the end of it through a different scheme, CTAS, for those who are interested, the tailored assurance scheme. The risk appetite and the risk position always indicates what you want to do as a result of any effort, and a certificate is the prescriptive controls, requires those for us to be able to stand behind that certificate. So although I'm rambling a little about other things, I can't see that Cyber Essentials as it is now could be any replacement for wider government accreditation. No, I'm going to say the simple answer is no. However, if anyone wants to talk a little wider and around that, I'm more than happy to be emailed on that, because it's kind of a wide and varied subject, risk appetite itself broadly, and the approach to that.
Thank you, Ellie. I've got a bit of a complicated one here for you, Neil. It's about an answer that we gave before about segmenting off a section of the network. It said that it was answered that any internet connection is a failure. And then it says, however, your guide for 3.1 says can establish user-initiated outbound connections to devices via the internet. Most relevant systems are not user-initiated connections. This may just be license checking or API connectivity, etc. So I'm not completely sure what the question is, but maybe you could just speak a little bit about that again, about the difference between user-initiated connections and other connections when it's separated from the internet.
You know, actually, it's the first time I've heard that come up and asked in that way. I certainly think that may be something we need to have a discussion about, and that's a good piece of feedback to understand. We will have to discuss that further within the technical working group as that, unless there's anybody on this call who has another thought on it. I would have to investigate that further as what we do about that kind of scenario. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to make a note of that and discuss it further. So thank you for that feedback. Very useful. Right, just seeing if there's any other unanswered that are coming in. Sorry. Right, so I think yours in an educational settings, student devices on a segmented VLAN with access to the internet. Is that in scope?
No, if that's got student devices only on it, that segment is not in scope.
Great. I think most of the others have been answered. Oh, hang on, another BYOD. The need for controls on BYOD devices used to access VDI is due to a vulnerability in the way that VDI is implemented? That's a question. Can you clarify or confirm?
Quite simply, the reason for this is if you look at what the vendors are saying, the vendors need that the client access software needs to be on a supported operating system, and that client access software must be kept up to date and updated with all their latest security updates. So we are listening and looking at what the vendors do as regarding this. Yes, there are known vulnerabilities carried out by commodity attacks against those devices trying to access those sessions and screen recording those sessions. There's a number of published that happened on Dell-wise terminals that took place. So that is why BYOD are in there. There is evidence, and we're not shared all the evidence or all the vulnerabilities, etc., by the technical people at the NCSC, but they, when we discuss this and have had that discussion with their subject matter experts, those devices must remain in scope because there are known commodity internet attacks taking place against them.
Great. For software development like Python, there are often many third-party packages from repos. How does this fit Cyber Essentials for keeping up to date?
Well, quite clearly, if the repos are supported, that's fine. They are, they can stay on a segment or that is CE compliant. Where you're using non-supported ones, they'll have to be running a VLAN or a network segment which is taken out of scope of Cyber Essentials. Difficult area. We have a lot of discussions with developers, etc., about this, and we know that there are unsupported different tools, software development tools, etc., because their clients are asking them to support older software systems. They will have to be on a VLAN or a network segment that will need to be taken out of scope.
Great. There's one last question come in. I'm not sure if Andy's answering it. So that is for device unlocking for in A511. Please can you put into context use solely by to access the device, and when would you defer to a 12-character password? Just looking for some context.
I can answer this if you want now.
Okay.
I answered it earlier, but I think because the chat's been so quick, it's probably got lost. I think it's the second time it's come in today. So what we're talking about for device unlocking is you are only unlocking that device with the credentials, as opposed to something like a device that you would be on an Active Directory network where you could log into many devices with the same credentials. So that's the difference. When you're only unlocking a device, that is when the device unlocking controls must be applied. And when you are, if you are logging something that's connected to a network, so as in like an Active Directory network, for example, that is when you would go through to the 12-character password or the other controls. So minimum 8 character with a password denialist enforced, or 8 characters, and of course MFA, which is our favourite.
Great. One more question. If a VM running on an in-scope device is not accessing organisation data and services, is it still in scope?
You want to take that one or me, Andy?
I guess so. All software that's installed on that in-scope device needs to be included in the scope of the assessment. We are talking about virtual machines at the moment and potentially looking at alternative methods of segregation and subsetting for them, but we're not there yet. So yes, they would be in scope, those virtual machines. Do you agree with that, Neil? You happy with that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I would, I don't think we could make any judgment on that because we would have to know the usage of what that VM is used for. But it's a very general definition of data and services, to be honest. If somebody's got a VM on their machine, they're doing something for the business with it. So you could class either of them as services and data in that regard. So I would stay at this stage until we find a way of making VM segregation fit within the scheme. That VM is in scope because it's on an in-scope device.
Thank you. So I think all the questions, I know they'll come in as soon as I say this, have been answered, but we've had another comment to say, not a question, a thank you. This has been massively helpful. Regular sessions like this to cover changes and challenges in current thinking of the working group would be wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, I mean, I'll pass back to Ellie in a minute. From our point of view in IASME, this has been really helpful as well, because we need your comments and feedback, and as has happened a couple of times today, you've asked questions that we like, oh yes, we better go away and think about that. So that's been helpful for us as well. I don't think there are any more questions, Ellie, so I'll pass back to you.
I do the topping and tailing. I'm glad I got to jump in and do a little question in the meantime. So much of this is technical, and the technical working group and the technical people in IASME and NCSC were on this. Now, as this was a rerun, the Chief Technical Officer of the NCSC, who is obviously on the technical working group, he's on leave today, and we managed without him, and managed very well. Thank you, Andy and Neil, done excellently. I'm very interested in how we reach out more on these sorts of things. I hear those questions particularly. The government scheme is government. We do use IASME as our delivery partner. I shouldn't say use, Emma, I should say work collaboratively with, but hopefully everyone understands what that means. Use you in the best possible way to reach absolute maximum scale that we can with a scheme such as this. So, whilst it's very much government-based and for government purposes, the threat assessment initially, the risk assessment and the approach to certification has to be something that's government-led. It doesn't mean we don't want to engage with industry very widely in getting it right and making it accessible and achievable to highest possible amounts. So I'm very keen on going wider with this. Not to say we'll be doing this every week, because with the IT problems before, it's taken a number of weeks to even get this session up and running. but we will make a true effort to engage and get feedback more. Emma did say, watch this space, and I will echo that to say we really appreciate this. I'm gratified to see the questions come in. I'm very pleased that the one comment was received saying this has been massively helpful, because that is the intention. So I'm very, very glad that you all managed to join. I think there was a fairly high number of attendees, but it could be that we didn't quite scoop up everyone that we had in the initial event that couldn't go ahead. So we'll continue with our efforts to engage wider and provide clarity at any point we can over anything that we're doing in this space. So other than a big thank yous to IASME, who ran most of this with a little bit less NCSC partnership than we did hope initially, but I don't think it detracted in the slightest. I'll tell the CTO he can step away, shall I? Or possibly not. If that's it, I just see a couple more positive comments coming in, so that's wonderful. Then I'm going to draw a close to it. I think we went a little over, didn't we? But you know, I don't care. For having failed before to deliver fully at the successful session, I'm quite happy to have run over slightly. Please continue. I think if we cease the event, I'm not sure if any more comments can come in, but the email address is there for anything you haven't had a chance to submit, or if anything comes later. And then from that, I'm going to just say thank you and goodbye, and we'll see you at another event much like this. Okay, good. No other comments then. Okay, so I'm going to turn my camera off and leave, and thank you once again.